Hello and welcome to a Sunday morning meetup in which I discuss 10 British novels from the 1980s. The 10 novels I've picked represent each year of the decade from 1980 to 1989. British novel number 1 was published in 1980. Necropolis, which is a gothic novel by Basil. The novel is set in Victorian England. Clyde Beatty, a private investigator, is hired by Angela Meredith to investigate her father's death. His investigations lead him to a nursing home in Surrey, directed by the sinister Dr. Horace Couchman. After an autopsy reveals the murder of Miss Meredith's father, Dr. Couchman flees to London, leading Beatty eventually to the eerie Brockwood Cemetery and a criminal conspiracy involving millions of pounds worth of gold bullion. Other British novels published in 1980 include The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, which is the sequel to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. The Key to Rebecca by Ken Follett. The Devil's Alternative by Frederick Forsyth. And Rites of Passage by William Golding. British novel number 2 was published in 1981. Loitering with Intent by Scottish author Muriel, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1981. It contains many autobiographical references to Sparks' early career. Fleur Talbot is struggling to complete her first novel, Warrender Chase, in London in the early 1950s. She manages to secure a job working for Sir Quentin Oliver as secretary to the Autobiographical Association, whose eccentric members are seeking to write their memoirs. Fleur assists them and gains valuable source material for her novel, while growing increasingly suspicious that Sir Quentin may be blackmailing the association's members. Sir Quentin, meanwhile, discovers Fleur's novel in progress and seeks to suppress it as it reveals his plans. Fact and fiction imitate each other as Fleur and Sir Quentin compete for the truth. Other British novels published in 1981 include A Good Man in Africa by William Boyd, which was filmed in 1994. The film starred Colin Friels, Sean Connery, John Lithgow, Joanne Whalley, Dana Rigg and Louis Gossett Jr. And Sharpe's Eagle, which is a historical novel in the Richard Sharpe series by Bernard Cornwell. The series was televised with Sean Bean as Richard Sharpe. British novel number 3 was published in 1982. Before She Met Me by Julian Barnes is a black comedy which scrutinises the awakening of sexual jealousy in a dull and otherwise sensible college lecturer. After 15 years of marriage to a nagging woman who despises everything about him, Graham Hendrick files for divorce and marries Anne, a beautiful former actress and seemingly the woman of his dreams. Initially he believes this to be the start of the good life and congratulates himself daily, hourly, but as he learns more about Anne's past, he starts to obsess over the time before he knew her, resenting her previous love affairs, apparently unable to accept that she enjoyed a life at all before they met. As Graham imagines non-existent humiliations and concocts plans for revenge upon previous lovers, his increasingly strange behaviour begins to alarm first his wife and then his friend Jack, whom he soon suspects of having an affair with his wife. Other British novels published in 1982 include An Ice Cream War, which is a darkly comic war novel by Scottish author William Boyd. 2010, Odyssey 2, which is a science fiction novel by Arthur C. Clarke. It is the sequel to the 1968 novel 2001, A Space Odyssey. And The Man from St. Petersburg, which is a thriller by Ken Follett. British novel number 4 was published in 1983. The Woman in Black is a horror novel by Susan Hill, written in the style of a traditional Gothic novel. The plot concerns a mysterious spectre that haunts a small English town, heralding the death of children. The story begins with Arthur Kipps, a retired solicitor. The story is based on his horrific experiences several years in the past. Many years earlier, while still a junior solicitor, Kipps attended the funeral of a Mrs. Alice Drablow. The late Drablow was an elderly and reclusive widow who lived alone in the desolate and secluded Eelmarsh house. The house is situated on Nine Lives Causeway. At high tide it is completely cut off from the mainland. Kipps soon realises there is more to Alice Drablow than he originally thought. At the funeral he sees a woman dressed in black and with a pale face and dark eyes, whom a group of children are silently watching. While sorting through Mrs. Drablow's papers at Eelmarsh House over the course of several days, he endures an increasingly terrifying sequence of unexplained noises, chilling events and appearances by the Woman in Black. In one of these instances he hears the sound of a horse and carriage in distress, closely followed by the screams of a young child and his maid coming from the direction of the marshes. What happens next is, but you'll have to read the story to find out. Other British novels published in 1983 include Hollywood Wives by Jackie Collins, The Little Drummer Girl by John le Carré, The Colour of Magic by Terry Pratchett, and Scandal or Priscilla's Kindness by A.N. Wilson. British novel number 5 was published in 1984. Empire of the Sun by J.G. Ballard. The name of the novel is derived from the etymology of the name for Japan. The novel recounts the story of a young British boy, Jamie Graham, who lives with his parents in Shanghai. After the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan occupies the Shanghai International Settlement, and in the following chaos, Jim becomes separated from his parents. He spends some time in abandoned mansions, living on remnants of packaged food. Having exhausted the food supplies, he decides to try to surrender to the Imperial Japanese Army. After many attempts, he finally succeeds and is interned in the Lungua Civilian Assembly Center. Although the Japanese are officially the enemies, Jim identifies partly with them, both because he adores the pilots with their splendid machines and because he feels that Lungua is still a comparatively safer place for him. Towards the end of the war, with the Japanese army collapsing, the food supply runs short, Jim barely survives, with people around him starving to death. The camp prisoners are forced upon a march to Nantao, with many dying along the route. Jim then leaves the march and is saved from starvation by airdrops from American planes. Jim returns to Lungua camp and soon after returns to his pre-war residence with his parents. Other British novels published in 1984 include Flaubert's Parrot by Julian Barnes, Hotel du Lac by Anita Bruckner, The Fourth Protocol by Frederick Forsyth, and The Paper Men by William Golding. Book number 6 was published in 1985. Black Robe is an historical novel by Brian Moore set in New France in the 17th century. Its central theme is the collision of European and Native American cultures soon after first contact. First Nations peoples, historically called French Jesuit priests black robes because of their religious habit. In Quebec, a tribe of Algonquian agree in exchange for muskets to guide the Black Robe, Father Laforge, and his 20-year-old French assistant Daniel Davost for a few weeks upriver to a spot beyond a set of rapids. There, Father Laforge travels onward to the Huron village where a Jesuit mission is already established. Along the way, Father Laforge falls under suspicion of being a demon, and his attempts to convert and baptize his Algonquian guides are unsuccessful. He is captured by unfriendly Iroquois who torture him, but he escapes and eventually arrives at the fever-ridden Huron village. In exchange for promising them a water cure for the sickness, the Indians agreed to be baptized. Other British novels published in 1985 include The Good Apprentice by Iris Murdoch, Rebuilding Coventry by Sue Townsend, and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. Book number 7 was published in 1986. The Old Devils by Kingsley Amis. Alan Weaver, a writer of modest celebrity, returns to his native Wales with his wife Rhiannon, sometime girlfriend of Weaver's old acquaintance Peter Thomas. Alan begins associating with a group of former friends, including Peter, all of whom have continued to live locally while he was away. While drinking in the house of another acquaintance, Alan drops dead, leaving the rest of the group to pick up the pieces of their brief reunion. The Old Devils is considered to be Amis's masterpiece by his son Martin Amis, who wrote in his memoir, "It stands comparison with any English novel of the century." The novel won the Booker Prize, and it was also adapted for television by Andrew Davies for the BBC in 1992, starring John Stride. Other British novels published in 1986 include The Bridge by Ian Banks, The Reverse of the Medal by Patrick O'Brien, A Perfect Spy by John le Carré, and The Light Fantastic by Terry Pratchett. Book number 8 was published in 1987. The Commitments by Irish writer Roddy Doyle, and is the first episode in the Barrytown trilogy. It is a tale about a group of unemployed young people in the north side of Dublin, Ireland, who start a soul band. Two friends get together to form a band, but soon realise that they don't know enough to get much further than their small neighbourhood in the north side of Dublin. To solve this problem, they recruit a friend they'd had from school, Jimmy Rabbit, to be their manager. He accepts graciously, but only if he can make fundamental changes to the group, the first being the sacking of the third and mutually disliked member, their synth player. After this, Rabbit changes their name, making them the Commitments. With music fanatic Jimmy Rabbit as their manager, The commitments seek to fulfil their goal of bringing soul to Dublin. Other British novels published in 1987 include Moon Tiger by Penelope Lively, The Child in Time by Ian McEwan, The Shell Seekers by Rosamund Pilcher, and A Fatal Inversion by Ruth Rendell. British novel number 9 was published in 1988. The Gift of Stones by Jim Crace. The novel, written in poetic language, takes place at the end of the Neolithic period and is narrated by the village storyteller. As a boy, the storyteller lost an arm and became an outcast to the villagers, who rely heavily on their stonemasonry skills. The boy leaves the confines of the village in order to seek a role for himself and discovers his adeptness at telling stories. The storyteller returns to the village, but most of his time is spent acting as a protector for a widow and her child, who had also been forced out of the village and live 2 days' walk away. Periodically he returns to the village charged with new stories to tell. The novel deals with the nature of truth and fiction. The reader is often presented with variations of the narrative and invited to judge which, if any, to accept as reality. It also deals with social change and the effects of revolutionary new technology, and as such could be seen as sympathising with the victims of our modern post-industrial age. Other British novels published in 1988 include Sharp's Rifles by Bernard Cornwell, The Swimming Pool Library by Alan Hollinghurst, and Duncton Wood by William Horwood. British novel number 10 was published in 1989. Restoration by Rose Tremain. The novel tells the story of Robert Muriel, who begins the book as a medical student studying alongside his serious, practical friend John Pierce. John is a studious, pious counterpart to Muriel's shallow obsession with status, drinking and eating to excess. Pierce condemns the sinfulness of Muriel's lifestyle, but Muriel is unaffected by his comments. Muriel is asked by his father to visit the king with the aim of continuing their family's connection with the royal family, but Muriel embarrasses both of them by his nervousness. However, later King Charles II asks Muriel to care for one of his dogs, who is grievously ill. Muriel's decision not to apply any of the traditional cures of the era leads to the dog recovering naturally, and he's then appointed surgeon to all of the king's dogs. The king then arranges a marriage of convenience between Muriel and one of his mistresses, Celia Clements. This is done purely to fool the king's other mistress, Barbara Castlemaine. Muriel is given an estate named Bidnold in Norfolk, and Celia is installed in a house in Kew, where the king can visit her secretly, and the story continues from there. Other British novels published in 1989 include London Fields, which is a black comic murder mystery by Martin Amis. Any Old Iron by Anthony Burgess. Stark by Ben Elton. And The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. And now for this week's Sunday sentence.